on this episode of the Passionate Homeschooler Podcast.
For a while, I let my students use electronics and computers to take notes, and then I finally just shut it down and said, no electronics. You need to write by hand because you're going to remember information better. And when they would argue that they can't write fast enough, I would have to teach them how to take notes. And so in my history classes, I would spend a class session talking about the best way to take notes in different note-taking systems, and writing notes by hand. You will retain more information, particularly if you're able to write cursive. Anybody can learn cursive if they practice every day. It's one of those skills you just have to practice. Whether it's piano or guitar or soccer or whatever you're doing, it takes practice to master any skill.
Co-founder Deanna is back with us to talk about the importance of cursive handwriting, an old-fashioned skill that has all but disappeared from standard education. We talk about the benefits of cursive, how important it is to the physical and cognitive development of a child, and why it's an almost forgotten subject. Now, if you're a parent who would like to see your child learn this beneficial skill, the Pizan Academy is launching live online classes that teach cursive in short half-hour sessions twice weekly. Find out more about this and other classes offered by the Pizan Academy by going to pizanacademy.com/classes or check out the link in the show notes. Here's the conversation with Deanna. Cursive is one of those old-fashioned skills that used to be essential in education, and nowadays, and with rare exception, it's no longer being taught. It kind of falls into that same category as phonics, something that is not only rare, but there are a few people that are even aware of it. So let's start with a definition.
Cursive is a form of writing by hand where you join letters together to form words.
So meaning that when you are applying your pen or your writing implement to your writing surface, you're not lifting it from the surface.
Absolutely.
So it's just continuous writing.
Right.
And this is to be contrasted with another form of handwriting where each letter is a separate action. So you would lift your pen after each letter. That's something called block writing.
Right, or printing as we know it. Exactly. And so cursive, it actually, once you get the hang of it, you're able to write a lot faster.
And so it would seem that in an age of mostly paper-driven communication, where people would write letters to each other or other forms of correspondence, that the skill of being able to write faster on paper would be very useful. But of course, we live in a different age, and that is not something that people really do a lot of. Like, you know, we do email, we might text each other, but we don't really write down our thoughts on paper.
Correct. And, you know, it's interesting in a lot of students don't really write at all hand to paper unless maybe they're taking an exam in class or something and they have to use, you know, or handed a piece of paper to write on. But a lot of students, I mean, even when I was teaching college, some of the penmanship that I would get was a little shocking because you could tell that these students were not used to writing, handwriting, and had not really even mastered block printing.
So even though it doesn't appear that handwriting or even cursive handwriting has much of a use in our modern age, there are reasons to acquire this skill.
Absolutely. There have been so many studies, and even recently, since 2016, there are just many studies that have been done on the importance of handwriting or the benefits of handwriting. And these are across a lot of different disciplines. It's not just education. People that are in, say, neuroscience or psychologists, they're studying handwriting and its benefits or the neural pathways that are being used when writing in cursive versus either typing or printing. And it's fascinating research. And what they're finding is that there are so many benefits to writing in cursive, particularly for young kids when they are, learning some of these fundamental skills like motor skills and how to, create, how to write words, how to read, all of these different things. If cursive is integrated, then they have such a better opportunity to learn in either a quicker rate or are better at doing certain things.
Well, so what are some of those specific benefits? Because, when we look at this strictly from a utilitarian point of view, it's pretty clear that if we do live in this technological age where paper is becoming less and less important, that there really isn't a practical use for this, is there? Or is there?
There absolutely is a practical use. I mean, so just to kind of go through a laundry list of benefits of cursive, what it does, like, and I even alluded to this, is that neural pathways. When you write in cursive, there are these pathways that are joined between your right and your left side of your brain. So you're using both sides of your brain, and that is something that is great. So that will help with memory. And so you'll be able to retain information that you're writing. And again, there are so many studies on students of different ages about whether if they take notes by hand, by cursive versus printing, but also typing versus handwriting. And students retain a lot more information if it's written in cursive because it gets gets both sides of your brain working together.
Okay, so I do, I can kind of see that there might be a benefit to associating a physical action with some kind of conceptual thought or mental unit. And that's something that we've heard all of our lives, that if you write something down, you're more apt to remember it. But still, isn't the action of typing out the same letters that you would normally write by hand, isn't that also a physical action? What would be the difference between the two actions in terms of memory, development? What does the research tell us?
So the research on this, and they've hooked up the sensors on the brain, and they can tell what part of the brain is being activated. One of the articles that I'm familiar with, they did this with 12-year-olds. And so they could see when a 12-year-old was printing that certain parts of the brain were activated. Whereas if they were typing, the parts of the brain that were activated, it wasn't as many, and it wasn't in the same patterns. But when the kid was writing in cursive, that had the most brain activation. And so what that says is that it increases their focus and they're able to retain that information because they're using more of their brain. And I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm an educator. So I don't understand like down to the actual different parts of the brain and what that means. But when you read these studies by these neuroscientists working with educators to understand what the difference in dealing with how to take down information or how to write, it's very fascinating to see that cursive is the one way of writing communication, whether it's typing, printing, or cursive, but it's cursive that seems to engage the brain more than the other two.
Wow, so there's actually some research behind these suppositions that there are physiological and neurological benefits to this mode of putting your thoughts down on some kind of medium. So beyond just
Absolutely.
typing or just even block writing.
Absolutely. And if you're teaching younger kids cursive, it really does help with their motor control. And if you've ever been around young kids that are learning to print and doing their block letters, a lot of times they will print their B's or P's or any of those looped letters. They can invert those and put those backwards. And that has to do with, it's called dysgraphia. And so that has to do with just learning the motor skills and, figuring out the writing. Studies have also shown that kids that are taught cursive from a very early age, they don't have those same issues with reversing letters. So,
So you
and
mean
we
that
also,
dysgraphia is something that can be overcome by learning cursive, or do you mean that the studies that you reference, are they saying that learning cursive can help a child avoid dysgraphia?
well, if they're learning cursive first, what it does is it helps with these fine motor skills and the way that the brain interacts with the hand. And
Okay.
so it can give them some of these motor skills. They'll learn them a little bit differently and they'll learn them better. And so when they go to print, their brain is already trained on these motor skills, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Now, but I still have to go back to the utilitarian question, which is that we practically don't live in a world where we're communicating by handwritten letters or any kind of correspondence. So, what would be the practical use of learning this skill beyond, obviously, if the studies are correct, then there are some cognitive and neurological benefits, but what other benefits can there be for learning the skill?
And again, data show all of these benefits that I'm talking about. But if you learn cursive, you become a better speller. And that's because your brain, once again, is being activated. And so as you're writing cursive, you're sounding out and you're able to um, understand how words come together to make sounds.
Oh, so we referenced phonics earlier,
Right.
and we'll have to devote another episode to the benefits of phonics.
Absolutely.
But you're suggesting that the skill of cursive can amplify phonics as well,
Definitely.
and
And
thereby the understanding of spelling.
Definitely. And so what we see is that cursive writing helps with focus, and we know that. And again, it's the same sort of reasonings with those centers of the brain being activated. And so when a student is writing cursive, they're more focused. They can use sort of this visual remembrance of how sounds are written in cursive, which helps with their spelling. They can write faster, so they can express more ideas in a quicker way. So when I was growing up, I got not the best marks in handwriting, and accompanying that grade in handwriting, because we were graded on our handwriting. It was just one of the standard things on the report card. The teacher would always write, "Her brain works faster than her hand." And so I think that is the case. And so I think that is why a lot of students, and even students that I've worked with from elementary school all the way up through college, they don't like printing. They don't like writing by hand. And that's because they're doing this block printing and it just takes too much time. And
And
that,
perhaps maybe the act of lifting the pen from the paper multiple times becomes almost like a water torture. You're just repeatedly having to interrupt your thoughts. So conceptually, it's really breaking your thoughts up into pieces.
absolutely. And it takes a lot more effort to, write out those block letters. Even if I am printing and trying to print neatly, I can write cursive neatly a lot quicker because of, just joining those letters.
But it is a skill, and it is something that has to be developed. You have to learn the process and be able to automatize it. And furthermore, when we think about cursive, we look at, if we were to look at the regular character-based alphabet, in general, each of the letters looks very uniform, but the standard block letters don't naturally connect with each other. So therefore, cursive ends up being a stylized version of those block letters that have to be reformed and stylized in order to connect. So that makes it not just a simple matter of memorizing our alphabet. It's a matter of memorizing this particular stylized version of the alphabet and then how to connect each of the letters together.
Exactly. And so when you're printing, you learn the letters first if you're printing. But an interesting thing is that Maria Montessori, and she was the creator of the Montessori method of teaching, she argues that cursive should be taught before printing. And that because of what we've talked about the motor skills and being able to write more words and write faster and expressing more ideas, it helps train the brain with, visual and tactile information, that fine motor dexterity, and it gets both sides of the brain working. And so all of these are very beneficial. And she's known for saying that easily, kids by the time they're 4 years old can definitely learn cursive. And that was sort of her methodology. Now, again, that isn't what we do today, and that even when I was growing up, I learned how to print before I learned cursive. But it's an interesting approach, and there's these two camps in education: those that do advocate for teaching cursive, which isn't everybody, but whether or not you should learn cursive first or printing first. And it's really an interesting sort of revolutionary way of thinking of maybe teaching kids cursive first because of these benefits.
So I want to just go back to this idea of what the usefulness of the skill itself. If we've established that studies have shown that there are cognitive, neurological, and physiological benefits, and that tells us that it's a worthwhile practice. But if we go back to, again, the utilitarian benefits, what would the student of cursive expect to be able to use that skill for going forward? For example, if we taught a foreign language that a child will never need to speak for the rest of their life, then is that really a benefit? And I think that can apply here unless there is some kind of a benefit.
Well, there absolutely is a benefit, and that goes back to that memory retention. So when you write cursive, you remember things. If you type something, you're not going to remember it as much. And again, there are many studies on this and writing and memory. And so when I was teaching in the classroom, for a while, I let my students use electronics and computers to take notes. And then I finally just shut it down and said, no electronics. You need to write by hand because you're going to remember information better. And when they would argue that they can't write fast enough, I would have to teach them how to take notes. And so in my history classes, I would spend a class session talking about the best way to take notes and different note-taking systems, and writing notes by hand. You will retain more information, particularly if you're able to write cursive. There's a visual element to cursive with your brain that you will tend to be able to recall words on a page just visually like you could an image, that you could perform better on tests. And also, if once you're out of school, continuing to write in cursive, say, if you're in a meeting and you're writing your notes in cursive, you're going to have better retention, better understanding. Your brain is going to be activated a little bit better than just sort of typing, which is, it's not necessarily passive, but your brain, I just wish that I could show you these brain scans right now, because it's fascinating to see how much of the brain is lit up when you're writing cursive versus typing. It's just astronomical.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the idea of taking notes, because if we think about taking notes as simply an academic process, something that you need if you're in class and you need to take down the notes so that you can pass a test, then it may seem like it has a certain limited use. But once you leave school and enter the adult world, then you'll no longer have a need for it. But on the other hand, any kind of business interaction, any kind of job interaction you have may at some point require note-taking.
Even if you're going into a trade and you're learning a skill, it will behoove you to take notes to remember, because there's this memory curve that if you take notes and you can look back at them, you'll have that information. But
what do you mean by a memory curve?
So the memory curve is that within 4 hours, 6 hours, 24 hours, how much information your brain will hold. And this is just kind of on average. And within 24 hours, you will forget 80% of what you've learned if it's a new thing that you're learning. So for instance, even if you're going into a trade and you're learning a skill like HVAC repair, like air conditioning repair, There is a lot of technical information that's going to be thrown at you. And if you don't take notes, there's no way your brain is going to remember everything you need to remember. Yeah, you could have a manual, you can have a guide and look back on it. But if you're writing out the notes, you will retain more than if you don't.
And I think there's an even deeper benefit to that, because we're talking now about using this process of writing down notes as a means to bolster long-term memory, which is actually quite true. And I'm sure we've all experienced it to some extent. But I think there's also a deeper level of understanding that you can have about your subject if you are handwriting the information down. Let me just paint a little bit of a scenario here. If you are taking notes from a book, for example, if you want to write down something that you're trying to remember from a book, if you were to type out the information, the process by which you are communicating the information to the typewriter keyboard is very fast, and I would argue fairly shallow. But if you're handwriting, your brain is trying to organize the information as your hand is writing it down. And so the pace at which you're going and the physical action of trying to write down these thoughts with your handwritten notes is almost forcing your brain to organize it in a way that is as clear as possible. You're by slowing yourself down, you're having to organize yourself to have it be stored in the most efficient way possible. Now, I am not an academic researcher, so I haven't performed the randomized study to validate this. I can only speak from my own experience, and that's what I have gone through myself. I once had a writing teacher tell me that if you ever wanted to truly understand a classic work, that you should handwrite it, hand copy it from start to
Absolutely.
finish. And I actually did that once. And by having to slow down the process of your reading it in order to transcribe it, your brain is processing it in a deeper and more thoughtful way.
Absolutely. That is a great example because, again, if you're writing it, you're activating more areas of your brain than if you're just typing. Typing isn't passive, but in a way, the way your brain responds to just typing on a keyboard, it's more passive than if you are engaging in particularly cursive and copying, because what you're doing is that you're going to read a sentence, your brain is going to think about it and then translate how to write that out in a different way of script, because obviously if it's typed out, it's going to be in a particular font. But if you're handwriting it, your brain has to tell your hand how to write those in a totally different set of characters.
Okay, well, I think therefore we have established that there are physiological, neurological, and even practical benefits to learning this skill.
Yeah, I don't know if I think we did touch on spelling and focus. So just to kind of hit the main points is motor function and spelling and focus. But it's like anything else that you learn, it takes practice. So if you want to learn how to play guitar, you can't just pick up a guitar, look at the notes or look at the chords or tabs and then play it. You have to remember, your hand and your brain have to remember what those chords are, where your fingers need to be placed on the guitar in order to make that sound.
And then ultimately it automatizes those small motor skills, those fine muscle actions.
Absolutely. It's like muscle.
Yeah, everyone talks about muscle memory. That's what's happening here. You're not having to tell your hand to move, 45 degrees down to the left and then swoop down in a curve. You're not having to consciously think about that, because if you do it with enough practice, then eventually you acquire the automatized skill.
Absolutely. And Maria Montessori, she did so much work in education, and particularly younger kid education. We're talking 4 to 6 years old. And she says that if you teach a 4-year-old cursive, it takes half the time to teach a 6-year-old cursive. And so the younger you get them, the easier it is for them to pick it up, because it just becomes part of their learning. And, kids at 4 years old, they're just sponges. And so, and she also said that 15 minutes a day practice, you can learn cursive, and anybody can learn cursive if they practice every day. It's one of those skills you just have to practice, whether it's piano or guitar or soccer or whatever you're doing. It takes practice to master any skill, and writing is not any different.
Okay, so we have established how useful and important it is to a child's development, but what we haven't established is why it fell out of favor. Why is this not standard in every curriculum around the world?
That's a good question that I still ask myself, but we do know some of the answers. So just looking at the history of cursive, that, this goes back to ancient Rome. And in the ancient Roman times, business people who were, having to write a lot, they came up with a way to formulate words and put letters together in order to write faster. And so by the 5th century AD, you have cursive being a very popular and very common way of writing for amongst people who did write. Now, not everybody in the society was literate and could write, but amongst those who were writing any amount, they would be writing in a cursive. And so we know it goes back pretty far. And so writing in cursive, if you look at what we call primary source documents, or these original documents, historical documents, a lot of times you see cursive writing. So it's been very predominant throughout the centuries. And even when I was going to school in the 70s and 80s, cursive was taught. And we have like I said before, I had handwriting grading. So I got graded on handwriting all the way through elementary school. And we spent time practicing, and we had cursive homework that we had to do and practice. Now, some different policies, educational policies came forth, and we had No Child Left Behind. And then in 2010, Common Core came in, and it was really in Common Core where they just took away any sort of handwriting or cursive training in the Common Core standards.
Okay, well, let's first of all take a brief second to define what that means. So when you say No Child Left Behind or Common Core, what do you mean exactly?
So
I know we've defined it on the show before, but let's have a little quick definition.
Sure. So these are federal education policies that states could adopt. And if the benefits, so let's just back up a little bit more. Education has always been left up to the states, and the founding fathers did that purposefully. And so usually the states are in charge of their own education, and you have a state board of education, and then you have local boards of education, and it's very regional. But in 1965, Johnson came out with the ESEA, the first sort of big federal policy.
President Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah. So he came out with this policy for a federal program. And what's attached to these federal programs are dollars. So if schools adopt these federal programs, and particularly No Child Left Behind, and then in Common Core most recently, then they get federal monies that will aid in making sure these programs are successful. And so it kind of just all ties to money for schools, because education or schools are always wanting more money.
So federal money, basically.
So this is federal monies. And so in 2010, Common Core standards came out from the federal government, and it replaced No Child Left Behind, which was the previous policy. And so if states or if school districts or schools adopted Common Core standards, and in some cases an entire state would adopt it and then mandate it down to the local districts, then they would receive funding. But in doing this, Common Core standards eliminated any cursive handwriting requirement. And so it was really in 2010 that we see a massive decline where schools just flat out stopped teaching it.
Okay, now, is that because the architects of Common Core consciously wanted to remove it from the curriculum, or was there some other reason why it was pushed down throughout the states?
Yeah, I don't think it was necessarily, and I haven't particularly researched that, but I wouldn't think that it's necessarily an attack on cursive. What I think is that, so there are these international standard tests, and the US has been falling lower and lower every year or every few years when they're taken. And so Common Core, the main objective was to get kids get the test scores up, particularly in language arts, reading, comprehension, those sorts of things, and in math.
So basically, if the purpose of Common Core was to raise test scores, then anything that didn't serve that purpose would be either dropped or de-emphasized.
Absolutely. So you
Okay.
have even science is de-emphasized. And in a lot of school districts, science is kind of an elective where you'll have a teacher come in maybe once a week for, a grade level to come in and do some little bit of science. It's kind of like art. So it's very interesting how Common Core really changed. Now, not all states adopted Common
Wait, no,
Core.
Common Core, you're not saying that Common Core changed. You're saying how Common Core changed the previous standard.
Right, how Common Core changed education. Sorry
Okay.
about that. Now, in 2016, there were still 15 states that had some sort of handwriting training, but I'm not 100% sure, but I would think that it wouldn't have been as intensive or as much time dedicated because there's been this shift to being, even schools and districts and states that didn't adopt Common Core, there's been this shift to a very test-centric education system where you're teaching the kids the skills they need to perform on these mandated tests.
And I guess it's not really, a test can't really capture whether you have qualitatively acquired a skill like handwriting.
Right, or even art or drama, or there's just so basically these tests capture abilities in language arts or English and math. There may be some history thrown in there with, being able to read a document and then analyze it. But in general, what's taught during the day, and I've been in classrooms in elementary schools where there is a big bulletin board, and every minute of the day is blocked out for the entire week. And so from 1:10 to 1:39 we're going to be doing this, and then 1:40 to 1 or 2:32 we're going to be doing, and some of them were just these really random times, so it's not even on the half hour or the quarter hour. Just we're spending 23 minutes on this, and then we're going to spend 24 minutes on this. And what happens is that, and this is probably a whole other podcast, but it doesn't give kids time to breathe, to process information. And so now we have this entire generation of kids that are just going from ping, ping, one thing to one thing to one thing, totally disconnected, which what cursive does. It slows you down, it allows you to focus, and it allows your brain to understand information. And that seems to just be going away.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this on a previous podcast about the 7 lessons of John Taylor Gatto. So take a look at that podcast to find out more information about it. But, it does seem that cursive would not be a skill that would be emphasized if the trend is to build the kinds of skills that would help you pass the standardized test scores.
Right. It's in this day and age, it's kind of seen as fluff, but I'm optimistic. In December of last year, in 2019, there was a lawmaker in New Jersey who put forth a sort of a mandate, and this would be for all public schools, that to start teaching cursive again and mandating it sort of as a subject that needs time and attention, not just, something that you can do passively.
Oh,
And
what was the result of that, Bill?
it's still, I
pending?
checked on it recently, and it's still kind of in there. COVID hit and everybody's focus shift.
Okay.
But that gives me sort of hope that these studies and this research that is being done across so many disciplines is maybe having some sort of impact on policymakers Now, I'm not always, the first person to want, the heavy hand say, we have to do this by the government. But I think that for schools that are so used to checking boxes and, okay, I've got to do this requirement, I've got to do this requirement, that maybe putting that back in as a requirement would be beneficial to kids.
Well, regardless of whether that is something that becomes a standard in your local public school, since our program speaks to either the current homeschooler or the aspirational homeschooler, we do have some recommendations to make about teaching your child this skill.
Absolutely. I mean, I started working with a couple of students, and one of them I'm working with on learning cursive. Now, he is in 6th grade, and his printing is what you would expect in a very digital age. It is barely legible. And so we're learning cursive. And
so what's your experience been with him?
It's going well, but it's a lot of practice. It's a lot of going through and explaining that, okay, so with printing, when you teach printing, you start with the uppercase and then you teach lowercase. With cursive, it's backwards from printing. Not that it's backwards, but it's different. You start with lowercase and then you transition to uppercase. And so once you kind of master the lowercase letters, you then transition to the uppercase letters. Now, some of those letters, like T and F, you do lift your pencil or your pen off the writing surface. And so that's a little trickier. Also, one thing that I've noticed is that he'll want to cross his T or dot his I before he finishes the word. And again, that's kind of a throwback to printing. And so these are the types of things that if you just start and I started with the loop letters. So O and A and C, anything that looks kind of loopy, we started. And then we went to L's and F's that have a skinny loop. And
you mean for lowercase letters?
For lowercase.
Okay.
So, and then I went in and started teaching. So I didn't do the alphabet in order. And that seemed to be very helpful, is having him work on letters that were similar at the same time.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know if it's because he's older and his attention span isn't as focused, or if that's just his personality, but that seemed to work with a kid that has a little more difficulty on focusing on these types of tasks. So we went through the loop letters, and then I had him practice, and then I had him practice writing some of the other letters. And then we finally did things like K and Z, which are very different and a little more difficult. And so we built up to those letters, and that seemed to work really well for him. And then we did the capital letters, and then we started putting words together.
Now, it's really interesting that there's such a contrast between the order in which you would learn uppercase versus lowercase with regard to teaching block printing versus cursive. But it makes sense that you would start with lowercase letters because you write far more of them, and it's really the uppercase letters that are the exception. But when you're printing block letters, I suppose the uppercase letters could be considered universal. So if you only knew the uppercase letters, you could still write something legible. But
I also think it has to do with motor skill, that for a child, it's easier to write the larger uppercase letters. And for cursive, it's easier to keep the pen on the paper flowing with lowercase letters.
Okay. Well,
so it might be related to motor function and just the type of the way the letters are formed. The capital letters are more difficult in cursive.
From your experience, what are some good resources for a parent who's interested in teaching their child cursive?
Well, the first thing is that you can find the cursive paper, which is different than the printing paper, because the cursive has an extra dotted line underneath the two, like the solid line on the bottom.
And so if you think about standard ruled paper that most students are familiar with, the cursive ruled paper has a third, that's a dotted line, right?
It's a dotted line. So
Yeah.
it's solid line, dotted line, solid line,
Mhm.
dotted line. And the bottom dotted line is for what we call the tails in cursive, those, lowercase g's that dip down, the Y, the Z. And so you can find practice pads and tablets of cursive paper available online. You can also find downloadable sheets that you can get free online. And so I would definitely recommend getting specifically cursive paper, not the printing paper. That's been very helpful for my student because I'm trying to get him that the lowercase letters usually only go up to that first dotted line, and then the tail needs to reach that second, bottom dotted line. And that's been helpful in forming the letters. And then another thing is just practice. I mean, go back to that Maria Montessori thing of 15 minutes a day. And I have him practice. He's now writing words. And so I'm having him practice pretty easy words right now. But it's interesting, as I'm teaching him cursive, I'm also teaching him phonics that he's never learned and how to sound out words. And he always says that he's a horrible speller. And then if he asks me how to spell something, I tell him, sound it out, and it's helping. And I think it's that, when he's writing cursive, he's sounding things out. And I think that's helping. But
Wow,
spelling as well.
That's great. So, I mean, there are plenty of resources that parents can go to if they want to teach their own child how to acquire this skill. What about the parent who wants to find somebody to teach that skill?
Well, at Pizan Academy, we just started some live courses, and our first ones that we have opened up for registration are teaching cursive. We have 3 levels, and basically the levels differ by pace. It's kind of mapped out by age group, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's more about how comfortable in printing, because that relates to the fine motor skills and how that translates to writing cursive.
All right. Well, where can someone go to find out more information?
They can go to Pizan Academy, PISAN academy.com/classes.
Thanks to Deanna for appearing on the show. Be sure to check out the link in the show notes to find more information about the cursive classes, as well as other live classes offered by the Pizan Academy. You can find more of Deanna on the Passionate Homeschooler YouTube channel, and we'll put a link in the show notes. If you like what you're hearing from us on the Passionate Homeschooler Podcast, make sure you subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening to this episode on your desktop, we can also be found on the iTunes podcast app, along with popular mobile podcast players. Also, consider giving us a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast platform. It really helps other people find the show and helps us grow as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.